I didn't go to the island for thrills. I went because the numbers didn't add up. They called it Ilha do Sargacho, a jagged smear of mangrove and pale sand, less than an hour's sail from the coast, visible on clear days like a dark eyelash against the silver horizon. In the past 3 years, I'd counted 6 small fishing boats that left the harbor toward it, and never came back full. 3 fishermen vanished without a trace. 2 teenage freedivers whose gear was later found washed up on the mainland, and 1 lone man who'd radioed in a frantic, half-coherent call before his signal dissolved into static. I knew the statistics because I'd gone looking for them. I'd combed through police logs, searched local papers, and even bribed a clerk at the harbor office for missing vessel reports. But there was nothing beyond the vaguest bureaucratic language. Further investigation pending. Accident at sea. Crew presumed lost. No follow-ups, no closure. Just rumors that grew darker the closer you got to the water. When I first asked about the island in town, people reacted in 2 ways. Either they shrugged and claimed ignorance, or their eyes shifted to the horizon and they fell silent, like they just heard a distant, private whistle. No one said its name, unless they had to. One old man selling shrimp told me, "Maps can't help you there, friend. That place decides if you come back." I wasn't chasing ghosts. I wanted answers. If it was dangerous currents, I'd find the patterns. If it was human, pirates, smugglers, there would be signs, something tangible, something explainable. I'd seen enough real tragedies dressed up as superstition to know that fear alone can make people erase places from their memory. But as the days passed, I began to wonder if the island's absence from official charts wasn't just forgetfulness, but something deliberate. When I finally decided to go, I hired a local skipper named João. Everyone said he was reckless enough to take me, but careful enough to survive. When I met him on the pier, he was loading extra fuel cans onto his skiff, but no life jackets. "They tangle you," he muttered when I asked. He didn't ask why I wanted to go. Just told me we'd leave before noon and be back by sundown, if we're lucky. That morning, the air smelled of salt and diesel, and the tide was already pulling outward. As we left the harbor, the shoreline shrank into a smudge behind us, and the water began to change. The blue turned darker, almost ink black, clinging to the hull's wake as though reluctant to let us pass. João didn't speak much, his eyes locked on the horizon. At one point, without looking at me, he said quietly, "Last chance. We can turn back now." I was about to answer when I saw the first buoy. It was white, scuffed, and stenciled with the number 12 in faded black paint. Odd, but not alarming, until we passed another, marked 11, drifting against the current, then 10. They were spaced evenly, like mile markers counting backward toward the island. By the time buoy number 7 bumped gently against our hull, João cut the engine. The sudden silence pressed in on us, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the faint slap of water. Ahead, the island loomed closer, a crescent of pale sand pinched between jagged rocks, fringed with mangroves whose roots knotted together like the ribs of a giant skeleton. Something about the air felt wrong. There was a sweetness to it, like overripe fruit. But underneath lingered the metallic tang of rust. The tide here moved sluggishly, as though the sea itself were tired. I lifted my camera to take a photo and froze. Just beyond the first line of mangroves, lashed to a trunk with sun-bleached paracord, was a trail camera, the kind biologists use to monitor wildlife. But this one wasn't pointed at the forest. Its dark lens faced the water and us. The town that faced Ilha do Sargacho was the kind of place that didn't appear in travel brochures, where the streets were a mosaic of cracked cobblestone and wet sand, and the houses leaned slightly as if bowing to the constant ocean wind. It survived on shrimp, gasoline, and the quiet exchange of secrets, and every conversation seemed to have an undertone of things better left unsaid. The pier was a skeletal stretch of salt-stained planks that gave underfoot with a sound like a swallowed cough. And under it, the water was always darker than it should have been. The kind of dark that didn't come from depth alone. Old men played dominoes in the shade, slapping down the tiles with a sharp clack that echoed off the corrugated tin walls, while women gutted fish with a practiced rhythm that seemed older than the boats themselves, their knives flashing briefly in the sun before disappearing into the shadows again. And through it all, the wind carried a smell of diesel, brine, and something, faintly metallic, that lingered in the back of your throat. When I asked directly about the island, most people pretended not to hear, some giving vague gestures toward the sea like a reflex, as if they were brushing something invisible off their shoulders. But every now and then, someone would let slip a fragment of history, Portuguese marker stones with dates so eroded they looked like scratches, whispers of a fever camp a century ago where entire crews died in the same week, a lighthouse that was lit for 7 nights and then extinguished forever, its keeper never seen again. None of this was written down anywhere official. No plaque, no museum display, no tourist daredevil video. Even online, the island existed only in blurry aerial shots taken at low tide, the mangroves spreading like black nerves into the sea, and even those images had a washed-out, overexposed quality, as if the island itself resisted being captured clearly. When I pressed the harbour master for a proper chart, he glanced toward the water and shook his head. "Charts get people killed," he said simply, and instead slid me a weathered photocopy of the coastline with the island missing entirely, erased as if by the side of a thumb, leaving only a faint smudge where it should have been. João, my skipper, avoided the subject as well, focusing on his preparations. But I noticed that even when other fishermen teased him about taking the gringo out to the ghost, he didn't smile. His jaw just tightened slightly, and his hands worked faster. It was only the night before we left, over a bottle of cachaça in the dim backroom of the dockside bar, that he said anything close to a warning. "The ocean there doesn't behave like it does here. It turns on itself," he muttered, staring into his glass. "And when it does, you'll know." The next morning, as we loaded the skiff, the tide was already on the turn, the sun a pale coin behind a haze that seemed to come from nowhere, and the gulls, normally loud and brazen, circled high but never crossed an invisible line between us and the open water, as though some boundary kept them at bay. It wasn't until we passed the last buoy with a number on it and the engine fell quiet that I realized how complete the silence was. Not just the absence of human noise, but the absence of life itself. No calls of birds, no splash of fish breaking the surface. Just the slow heave of the sea and the sound of my own breath, too loud in my ears. And that was when the outline of the island began to sharpen against the haze, its mangroves like a wall of twisted fingers, and the pale beach curving inward like a smile that didn't reach the eyes. João had the kind of face that looked carved from old wood, deep lines from years of sun and salt, eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the light around them. And though he claimed not to believe in curses, I noticed he never once said the island's name aloud. As we approached, his usual easy rhythm at the tiller stiffened, his shoulders rising slightly as if bracing for impact, and he began checking the horizon more than the engine, scanning the water in a slow, deliberate pattern. About halfway, there, the shoreline behind us had flattened into a faint grey smudge. The air seemed heavier, and the water shifted in color, deepening into an almost inky blue that clung unnaturally to the hull's wake, the ripples stretching out too far before fading, like the sea was reluctant to let us pass. I checked my phone, no signal, and my handheld recorder's little red light burned steadily, the only modern certainty in sight. João finally broke the silence, his voice low and even. "Last chance." "We circle. We don't land," he said, still not looking at me. "I need to see the beach," I replied, but he didn't answer, only tightened his grip on the throttle until his knuckles went white. That's when I spotted it. The first buoy, white and sun-faded, bobbing lazily against the current with the number 12 painted in thick black strokes, scuffed and peeling. A few minutes later came another, marked 11, then 10, each one spaced almost perfectly apart, like mile markers in reverse, counting down. towards something we couldn't yet see. The current here didn't seem to care about wind or tide, and the buoys swayed in unison as if tethered to the same unseen force below. I leaned over the side as we passed buoy number 8 and saw thick marine growth clinging to its base, the kind you'd expect after months in the water, but each had been freshly painted, as though someone was maintaining them. "Who put those there?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended, but João kept his eyes fixed forward and didn't respond. When buoy number 7 struck the side of our hull with a dull thud, he cut the engine entirely, letting the boat drift. The abrupt silence was almost physical, pressing in on us from all sides, broken only by the gentle tick of cooling metal and the faint slap of water against the bow. Ahead, the island began to rise from the horizon, a pale arc of sand flanked by jagged black rocks, its edges stitched with mangroves whose roots tangled together like the ribs of a giant skeleton. Half buried in the tide, the air smelled wrong, a sickly sweetness undercut by the metallic tang of rust, and though the surface of the water here was calm, I had the sensation that something beneath it was moving, slow and deliberate, just out of sight. I raised my camera to capture the shoreline, but froze when I noticed a glint of plastic and metal in the shadows. Lashed to the trunk of a mangrove, facing the water, was a trail camera, the kind used by biologists to monitor wildlife. Its lens, dark and unreadable, pointed directly at us. The sun had bleached the straps to a brittle white, and green algae traced the edges where the tide must have lapped at it, but it was unmistakably in working order. The thought that someone had been watching these waters, possibly watching us, sent a prickle down my spine, and I lowered the camera slowly, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing stirred, not a bird, not an insect, just the slow, breathing silence of the island holding itself perfectly still. The island was close enough now that I could make out the texture of its shoreline. The pale sand curved inward in a shallow crescent, pinched at both ends by jagged black rock that rose like broken teeth from the water. And behind it the mangroves formed a wall so dense it looked as if the island had grown its own barricade. The roots twisted into the surf like gnarled hands, their fingers locked together, trapping pockets of brackish water that reflected the sky in fractured shards. And above them the branches were heavy with dark, waxy leaves that swayed lazily in a wind I couldn't feel. The air here was thick, saturated with that same cloying sweetness, and beneath it a sharper note of iron that caught at the back of my throat every time I breathed. João kept the boat drifting parallel to the beach, the bow angled just enough to keep us from committing to landfall, his eyes flicking constantly between the shore and the water as if trying to decide which posed the greater threat. I noticed the absence before I could name it. There were no seabirds here, no gulls screaming overhead, no cormorants perched on the rocks drying their wings, just the low hiss of the tide pulling against the roots. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the weather or the season, but the stillness was too complete, too deliberate, as though the island had expelled everything alive from its surface. The trail camera I'd spotted earlier was just one of several. I began to pick them out now, strapped to different trees at irregular intervals, all pointed outward toward the sea, their lenses small and black and unblinking. Some were old, their casings bleached and warped, while others looked almost new, the plastic still glossy under the filtered sunlight, and the sight of them gave me the unsettling impression that the island wasn't being studied so much as guarded. João muttered something in Portuguese that I didn't catch, his voice low and sharp, and I turned to see his gaze, locked on a patch of sand halfway along the beach. At first I thought it was driftwood, but as we drifted closer I saw they were footprints, human, barefoot, deep in the soft sand as though made recently, and they trailed from the waterline straight into the mangroves, disappearing into the shadowed green without a hint of hesitation. "We circle," João said firmly, his voice suddenly more forceful, but my curiosity flared. Someone had been here, maybe was still here, and the idea of turning back, without knowing who or why, was unbearable. I told him I needed to at least get a few shots on land to check for any signs of camps or wreckage, but he shook his head, jaw tightening, and that was when I noticed his hand resting on the throttle, ready to gun the engine. The tide shifted beneath us, a subtle change in the rhythm of the swells, and the hull gave a faint, almost imperceptible shudder, like something large had moved under the boat. Joan's eyes darted to the water, then back to the mangroves, and I could feel the tension radiating off him. This wasn't just superstition. Something here had taught him to be afraid. I lifted my camera again, zooming in on the shadowed gap where the footprints disappeared, and for a split second I thought I saw movement deeper in the trees, a flicker of pale against the darkness, gone before my eyes could focus. The recorder in my lap picked up a faint hiss of static, then the kind you get from distant interference, though there was no signal. Here for it to feed on, and without thinking I reached for it, half expecting to hear a voice. Nothing came through, just the steady hush of emptiness. And when I looked up again, the mangroves were still, the footprints waiting in the sand like an unfinished sentence. Joan let the skiff drift, while his thumb hovered over the starter like a man weighing the value of his own breath. The footprints on the beach were a sentence begging to be finished, their edges still crisp where the breeze hadn't yet licked them smooth, and the longer I stared, the more they felt like a clock, counting down not from 12, but from common sense. 2 minutes, I said, already reaching for my pack. Camera, spare batteries, the handheld recorder, a lightweight tarp rolled tight. With paracord, telling myself that documenting the shore would justify the risk, that I could snap wide shots, grab a handful of sand for grain analysis, check the tidal rack for recent debris, and be back aboard before the island had time to notice me. Joan's mouth flattened into a line, and he shook his head once, twice, the second time slower, as if bargaining with something invisible between us. "You don't step on it," he said. But the engine coughed to life anyway, and he angled the bow, just enough to let the swell nudge us toward the shallows, the keel whispering over sand until the skiff's nose kissed the beach. The air felt different on land, warmer, thicker, sweet in a way that made my tongue itch. And as I hopped down into ankle-deep water, the silt rose in a brown cloud around my boots and drifted away like smoke. I waded forward, and the beach answered underfoot with a springy give, as if something deep below were breathing. 2 minutes, Joan repeated, louder now, and I lifted a hand without looking back, already tracking the footprints. They started at the tide line, toes toward the mangroves, spaced evenly like a calm walk. No sign of a run, no hesitation, and there was a second set overlapping here and there, smaller, lighter, so faint they almost weren't there. Whoever made them either weighed very little or didn't want to be noticed. I crouched and snapped photos, then pressed the recorder's mic close to the sand. Silly, performative, but the hiss of grains, shifting in the heat, would layer well under narration later, and that was when I realized the shoreline was wrong. The usual litter of shells and plastic and driftwood was missing. The rack line was clean, almost curated, as if someone had confiscated anything that didn't belong. I followed the prints to the mangrove edge, where the roots rose waist-high and wove into each other like vertebrae, forming natural corridors of dappled green shade. Here, a length of sun-bleached paracord ran from one trunk to another at knee-height, knotted with a fisherman's neatness, and just beyond it, half buried in the muck, glinted a brass cartridge casing gone green with patina. I fished it out with 2 fingers, dropped it into a sample bag, and felt the first true tap of fear against my ribs. Bullets, trail cams, numbered buoys, a sanitized shore. The island wasn't just cursed, it was curated. I lifted my camera for a long shot into the mangrove tunnel and caught 2 things at once. To the left, a rag of blue nylon snagged on a root, fluttering like a flag in dead air. To the right, a shallow groove pressed into the mud, 2 parallel lines with scuffed edges, the drag path of something heavy pulled toward the interior. "Time!" Joan called, voice closer than I expected. I turned to answer and saw he hadn't left the skiff, but had eased it broadside to the beach, one hand on the gunwale, the other still on the throttle, ready to rip us backward at a whisper. I took 2 more steps into the threshold of mangrove shade, enough that the island's smell intensified, syrupy sweet, spoiled fruit sweet, layered over the iron tang until the back of my throat went numb, and the recorder squelched with a staccato burst of static. I raised it instinctively, and the static fell away to a thin, breathy sound, like wind funneled down a pipe, and underneath it, a shape of syllables, not words exactly, but the cadence of them. Like something practicing speech. A chill flicked across my shoulders, and I thumbed the recorder off, suddenly angry at myself for letting sound become a story. I scanned the routes for electronics and found another trail cam further in, newer than the ones facing the sea, its lens hooded with a strip of taped-on rubber to keep glare down. Beneath it, someone had hammered a short aluminum stake into the mud and painted an arrow on it in chipped fluorescent orange, pointing deeper into the green. I thought about the missing teenagers, about the lone man's broken radio call, about the buoys counting backward, and every thread braided into a single stubborn conclusion. Someone used this island, someone wanted it invisible, and something, was keeping it that way. I stepped back toward the boat to prove I could still choose sense over compulsion, and that was when the beach spoke. No sound at first, just motion. The footprints I'd been following darkened as if a shadow had passed over them, then refilled with a slick tide of water that hadn't yet reached that far. It was impossible, a trick of the eye, but the film of wet spread precisely along the soul shapes and stopped flush at their edges, like the island was pressing its thumb down to stamp them fresh again. "Enough!" Joan snapped, voice cracking. And the skiff's engine flared. I forced myself to keep it methodical. One last photo of the regenerating prints, one last shot of the paracord line and the cartridge casing crater, one wide frame of the trail cameras like a jury. Then I turned toward the boat, lifting my pack, already composing the lines I'd speak later about currents and criminals and myths that hide men's crimes. The first step back into the shallows found no resistance. The second slid over an unseen ridge, and on the third, my heel hit something that yielded like meat. I jerked my foot away, and the water's surface peeled back from a pale, bloated thing the size of my palm. At first, I thought jellyfish until I saw the grid of crescent impressions in it. Shallow, evenly spaced, like teeth marks, healed smooth. It rolled once in the eddy from the skiff's prop, exposing a fray of plastic embedded on one side, the corner of an ID sleeve or a cheap phone case, then drifted under the boat and was gone. My stomach went hollow. "Now," Joan said, and I climbed in, boots dripping, the skiff shuddering as he threw it into reverse. We slid back along the kissing edge of the beach, hull whispering over sand, and for 3 heartbeats, I let myself believe we were retreating, that landing could be past tense. Then the engine coughed, not the dry, honest cough of fuel or fouled air, but a wet choke, as if the sea had reached up and palmed the prop. The bow slewed sideways, the stern kissed a root, and the skiff stopped dead. Joan swore, killed the throttle, and in the sudden silence I heard it. From the mangroves to our right, just beyond the paracord line, the delicate click of a trail camera waking to record, followed by another and then another. Further in, a chain of tiny mechanical eyelids opening one after another, deeper, deeper, like something was moving through them toward us, and every eye wanted to remember. The silence after the cameras clicked was the kind that swells, swallowing the sound of your own breath until even the beat of your heart feels intrusive. Joan's eyes locked on mine, and for the first time since we'd left the pier, I saw something raw in them, fear without disguise. "They're awake," he muttered, not clarifying who they were, and bent to check the prop, his movements sharp, economical, as though speed could keep the island from noticing. I shifted my weight to peer over the gunwale and caught the flash of something pale under the surface. But before I could focus, it was gone, replaced by the dull shimmer of silt disturbed by our hull. I told myself it was fish, debris, a trick of light, anything but what my instincts whispered. Watchers circling below. The air around us was changing, the sweet rot thickening, as if the mangroves were exhaling in slow, deliberate breaths. And from deeper within the shade came the occasional tick of mangrove roots, settling too. Rhythmic to be random. I scanned the shore again and spotted it, a cluster of half-buried objects 20 feet up the beach where the sand met the first roots, a dented cooking pot, the frame of a folding chair, a sodden pack of cigarettes sealed in a cloudy ziplock. I pulled my camera from my bag, zoomed in and saw more, fabric scraps tied to branches at shoulder height, some sun-bleached beyond recognition, others still vibrant, as if recently placed, marking, what? Territory? Paths? Traps? João noticed where I was looking and hissed through his teeth, shaking his head hard. "Don't!" he said, voice clipped. But my focus had already caught something else, a line of depressions in the sand, running parallel to the waterline, evenly spaced, too wide to be footprints and too shallow to be drags, like something heavy had been rolled along the shore. I switched the camera to video, panning slowly, catching the shine of what looked like glass half buried at one end of the line. Curiosity overrode caution, and I slung my pack over my shoulder, stepping back into the shallows. João's hand shot out, gripping my arm with a force that surprised me. "No further," he warned, his tone shifting from plea to command, but I shrugged him off, moving slowly toward the object. The sand sucked lightly at my boots with each step, a sticky, sucking sound too loud in the stillness. When I reached it, I crouched and brushed away the sand. It was a jar, sealed tight with black electrical tape, cloudy. Glass masking whatever was inside. I lifted it, felt the weight shift sluggishly, and a dark liquid sloshed within. Before I could inspect further, the jar twitched in my hand, subtle, like the internal pressure was shifting, and I almost dropped it. The feeling was faint but unmistakable, as if something inside had moved. My gut flipped, and I quickly set it back down, covering it with sand until it disappeared from view. As I straightened, a new sound rose from the mangroves, not the mechanical click of the cameras this time, but a soft, wet shuffle, like bare feet moving slowly through shallow water. The cadence was wrong for a human, too deliberate, too measured, and it was coming closer, threading between the roots with the patience of something that knew we weren't going anywhere. João's knuckles whitened around the tiller, but he didn't start the engine. I realized he was listening, counting the steps. They paused about 10 feet in, hidden entirely from view, and in the pause, a different sound took its place. The faint scrape of metal on wood, light and precise, like a blade being drawn across a hull in testing. Every instinct screamed to look over the side, but I kept my eyes fixed on the mangrove shadows where the presence lingered. Then, as if satisfied with its measurement, the sound stopped, replaced by silence so abrupt it was almost a relief, until something small and cold tapped against my boot. I looked down to see a cigarette lighter resting on the wet sand at my feet, its metal body etched with deep scratches in a pattern that might have been letters, though none I recognized. I bent slowly, picked it up, and as I did, João started the engine. Not with the roar I expected, but with a low, careful growl, pushing us backward into deeper water, eyes locked on the mangrove line, as though daring it to follow. The engine's low growl vibrated through the hull, steady but tense, like João was afraid to give it full voice, as though too much noise might draw something out from the mangroves. I kept the lighter in my palm, the metal slick with salt and faintly warm despite the overcast light, the scratched markings catching just enough reflection to look momentarily alive. We eased backward, the shallows deepening beneath us, but my eyes stayed fixed on the tree line where the footsteps had stopped. waiting for some confirmation that whatever was there had retreated, yet the roots seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, an illusion of movement created by shifting shadows, until one section held perfectly still for too long, the kind of stillness that belongs to something watching. João muttered under his breath in Portuguese, a string of short, clipped words I didn't understand, his gaze darting from the stern to the shoreline, and that's when I saw it, a narrow corridor between the roots, partially obscured by hanging leaves, where the water inside was darker than the surrounding shallows. Strung across it at waist height was another line of paracord, this one newer, taut, its knot sealed with heat-shrink tubing like a professional mooring line. Below it, faint in the muddy water, ran two parallel grooves, spaced about 2 feet apart, cutting deep into the silt and vanishing under the shade. Drag marks, unmistakable, leading inward. Without thinking, I lifted my camera and zoomed, catching the glint of something metallic at the far end of the grooves. But before the lens could focus, the water rippled from within as if something had slipped beneath the surface. João's hand clamped over the camera, shoving it gently but firmly down, his head shaking in a single, decisive warning. "No," he said simply, then turned his focus to maneuvering us along the curve of the beach. As the skiff angled away, the countdown buoys came back into view, floating just beyond the shallows. Numbers now ascending instead of descending. This was buoy 7 again, then 8, then 9. And with each one we passed, I felt the tightness in my chest ease slightly, as though the island's grip was loosening. I almost allowed myself to believe we were leaving it behind when a sharp, rhythmic splash erupted off our port side. João cut the throttle instantly, letting us drift as we both turned toward the sound. There, in open water no more than 30 feet away, a series of concentric ripples spread. Outward, centered on a patch where the surface bulged unnaturally. Something was pushing up from below, not breaking through, just displacing the water in slow, deliberate pulses. And as we watched, a length of pale cord, or what I thought was cord, rose briefly into view before sinking again. It was smooth, jointless, and just slightly too thick for rope, the motion sinuous rather than linear. João swore and restarted the engine, pushing the skiff forward with more force this time, his eyes locked ahead, refusing to glance back. I kept mine on the disturbance until it vanished, but not before I caught one last detail. The water there was lighter now, as if the seafloor had been scraped clean beneath it, the silt forming a drifting cloud that slowly trailed us like smoke from a fuse. The skiff cut through the water faster now, João's shoulders hunched forward, his knuckles bone-white on the tiller, the air behind us carrying a faint churn, as if the disturbance we'd seen was pacing our escape just beneath the surface. I gripped the side rail, scanning the open water for any sign of movement, but it was the shore that drew my eye, because we weren't moving straight out to sea anymore. João was angling us along the curve of the island, hugging its perimeter like a shadow, and the beach here was different, narrower, the sand darker, mottled with patches of black stone that glistened wet even where the tide hadn't reached. Above them, the mangroves thinned for a stretch, replaced by a tangled mass of low shrubs, their branches interlaced with strips of cloth that fluttered faintly in the still air, some fresh, some rotted to ribbons. I raised my camera, zooming in, and caught the glint of glass jars hanging from a few of the branches, their contents obscured by condensation. But one swayed enough for me to see what was inside. Bones, small and delicate, too uniformly shaped to be drift debris. The sight tightened something in my chest, but before I could process it, João muttered sharply, jerking his chin toward the water. A slick, dark shape had surfaced 10 yards off our stern, long and low, just under the chop, its edges too defined to be a wave. It kept pace with us effortlessly. No wake, no sound, and every few seconds a portion of it would dip and rise again, revealing a slick sheen that caught the light like wet leather. Then it angled slightly toward us, closing the distance, and I felt the skiff lurch as João pushed the throttle to its limit. The engine's roar broke the unnatural quiet, but almost immediately a new sound rose over it, a deep resonant knock from beneath the hull, slow at first, then in quicker succession, like something ramming us in measured bursts. I looked over the side just in time to see the water boil as the shape darted under the boat and vanished toward the shallows. Joan swung us hard starboard, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed ahead, and for a brief moment I thought we were in the clear, until the air filled with a sharp metallic snap from the mangrove line to our left. One of the paracord barriers had been cut, its bright strands recoiling like severed tendons, and beyond it, in the dim green, a figure stood just far enough back to be swallowed by shadow. I couldn't see details, only the impression of height and stillness, its outline unnaturally straight, the head tilted slightly as though listening. The figure didn't move as we passed, didn't step forward or retreat, but the moment its shape slipped out of sight behind the branches, a cold certainty settled in my gut that whatever lived here had just let us see it, not by accident, but as a warning, and that leaving the island would not mean escaping it. The engine strained as Joan kept the throttle pinned, the skiff shuddering with every wave. But the island clung to the horizon as if we were running on an invisible tether. Spray slapped my face in cold bursts, the salt burning my eyes. Yet I refused to look away from the water trailing us, because I could still see it there. That dark, slick shape keeping perfect pace just beneath the surface, sometimes splitting into two smaller shadows before merging again, like something deciding which side of us to strike. Joan didn't speak, his entire focus on keeping the bow pointed toward open water, but I could feel the tension in him, the way he kept glancing at the fuel gauge as though calculating whether we had enough to outrun it. Then, without warning, the shape dove, disappearing into deeper water, and a strange calm settled, too sudden, too complete. And that was when the first buoy reappeared, number 1 painted in flaking black, bobbing in the chop like a sentinel. We passed it, then another marked 0, a crude circle where the number should be, and Joan's shoulders eased fractionally as though crossing some invisible threshold. But the relief didn't last, because just ahead, floating on the swell, was something that should not have been there. A wooden dinghy, half sunk, its paint blistered from sun and salt, and inside it a scatter of objects, plastic bottles, a tangle of fishing net, a child's shoe turned on its side, the sole worn smooth. Joan swerved hard to avoid it, and as we passed, I saw the net shift slightly, not from the motion of the water, but as if something beneath had pulled it. The ocean ahead widened, the mainland now a hazy smudge on the horizon, and for a moment I thought we'd broken free until a sound rose behind us. A deep, rolling boom, not thunder, not a wave breaking, but the kind of sound that travels through the hull and into your bones. Joan's head snapped around, his eyes widening, and I turned to see a swell building in the water where the shape had vanished, the surface warping and hissing as if something massive was rising. "Hold on!" Joan barked, and the skiff leapt forward, the engine screaming as we rode the narrow gap between the growing surge and the deeper water beyond. I clutched the rail, teeth gritted, as the wave chased us, its crest feathering with foam until, just as it was about to catch our stern, it collapsed into nothing, leaving only calm water and the low, steady hum of the engine. Joan didn't slow until the first seabird appeared overhead, its cry breaking the spell, and only then did I realize how far we'd come. Yet even with the island shrinking into a speck behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really left it at all. That part of it had chosen to follow, unseen, waiting for the right tide to find us again. We didn't speak on the final stretch back to the harbor. The kind of silence that sat between us wasn't born from relief, but from the unspoken agreement that naming what had happened might give it more power. Joan cut the engine only when the pier's warped planks were close enough to touch, the hull sliding into the cradle of the mooring ropes with a soft bump. And even then, he kept glancing over his shoulder toward the open sea, as if expecting the slick shadow to break the surface right there. In the shallows, I stepped onto the pier, my legs unsteady not from the motion of the boat, but from the knowledge that we had crossed some invisible line and returned with more than we'd taken. In my pocket, the lighter felt heavier than it should have, the etched marks catching the fading light in patterns that almost seemed to shift if I looked too long. I thought about the trail cameras, the jars, the regenerating footprints, and the figure in the mangroves, pieces of a puzzle I could arrange, but never make fit. Joan refused payment, shoving my hand away with a muttered, "Keep your mouth shut," before turning his back and tending to his lines. And as I walked away, the sea breeze carried with it a faint trace of that same cloying sweetness from the island, so out of place among the diesel and salt of the harbor that I stopped in my tracks. Scanning the water, I saw nothing unusual, just the usual bob of anchored boats, gulls diving near the breakwater. But when I reached for my recorder, intending to log my impressions before they blurred, I found it already switched on, the tape counter spinning. I pressed play, expecting the sound of waves or static, but what came through was the faint, breathy cadence I'd heard in the mangroves. Shh, shh, rising and falling in deliberate rhythm, and beneath it, so faint I might have imagined it, a second voice, deeper, slower, speaking words I couldn't place. I clicked it off, my thumb trembling, and slipped it back into my bag, without replaying. Some things aren't meant to be chased, I told myself. Some places don't want to be mapped, and some islands, even when you leave them behind, never let you go. That night, long after the harbor had gone quiet, I woke to the sound of water lapping against something outside my window, slow and deliberate, like the tide reaching for a shore that wasn't there. And in the darkness, I thought I could still hear that breathy whisper, closer now, patient, waiting for me to answer.